Hello and welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be looking into a very important topic within social psychology, something that we call prosocial behavior. You might call it on your own being nice or doing stuff for other individuals. What we're going to be doing in this very first lecture is really laying the groundwork for a lot of substantial research that's been done on this that we're going to be covering, well, mostly in the second class. That being said, after we do come up with some terms and concepts that I want you to be aware of, we will be addressing some really interesting research that's been done historically on this topic in this lecture as well. But before we get to all of that, I do want to just help us first define what it is we're looking at. And to do this, one of the things that I often find is very helpful is to have us think of tangible examples relating to this concept of prosocial behavior. So what I'd like you to do is pause this video for a second or two and think about some things that you can recall where either somebody's done something nice for you or you've done something nice for somebody else. There are lots of different ways that you can go with this. These do not have to be monumental examples or very specific things, but what I'd like for you to do in this reflection moment is just have a running list of some things that you think would be linked to prosocial behavior so we can look at those later on. So please do pause me here and then move on to the next slide after you've thought of some examples. Okay, my hope is that right now you did pause and have a chance to reflect on some examples of things relating to prosocial behavior. Now in your heads, you have this list of things that you've done in kindness for others or others have done in kindness for you. And if we have those things, what we can do is then tie them to the scientific terms that social psychologists use to explain this phenomenon. All of the examples you've come up with are almost certainly examples of something that we call prosocial behavior. Social psychologists define this as any act that we commit that's in some way benefiting another individual. A classic example of things that I've seen students list before are studying for an exam with somebody else or carrying a book bag of another classmate. These types of things occur very often. Many people will commit prosocial acts on a regular basis within each and every day. But there are different types of prosocial behavior that exist that have gained some attention and also some debate over the years. One type of prosocial behavior that's been looked at extensively and sometimes accidentally used as synonymous with prosocial behavior, even though those doing research on this feel that that's not an appropriate thing to do, is this topic of something called altruism. Altruism is when we're committing a prosocial act, but when we're doing it, we are doing it in a way that either is coming at a cost to us or definitely in a way that has no foreseeable benefits to us when we're committing these acts. The classic example of an act of altruism that's often cited in textbooks is firefighters that ran into the burning buildings in New York on 9/11. Now, this obviously makes altruism look sort of like a sensationalized thing that never happens. That's something we're going to talk about a little bit later in debating it, but I don't think we need to go to that extreme to think of ways where people might help others without really expecting to get anything in return. It's important to note here that, as I talked about before, all acts of altruism are acts of prosocial behavior. That's just kind of inherent. But not all acts of prosocial behavior qualify as altruism. And anytime we're doing something and we expect some type of benefit from it, or maybe we just expect things to even out, well, then that's technically not an act of altruism. And this might lead you to ask, well, what could lead us to be prosocial or maybe even commit acts of what looks on the surface like altruism? Many early theorists who explored this idea suggested that maybe being altruistic or prosocial, if we want to kind of minimize what we're looking at, is a byproduct of something that's inherent within us. It's something that's genetically programmed into us because by having it there, our chances of passing along our genes within our species has been increased. And some examples as to kind of where this inherent idea came from are listed on this slide. One of the concepts that started to be discussed and explored in the 1990s was this idea of something called kin selection. This notion that within almost every species, we see prosocial behavior, or maybe even acts of altruism, but ones that seem to be very focused on individuals that share genetic overlaps. I'm guessing if you did list some really sensational examples of somebody helping you out, or you helping somebody out, there's a good chance that those activities probably revolved around either a family member doing something or potentially somebody that you might pass on your genes with at some point in the future. This is actually something that's been looked at in research by people trying to prove or disprove this kin selection theory. One of my favorites was one that asked individuals to hypothetically imagine themselves living in an apartment with somebody they're very attracted to, a family member, a stranger that's in need of help on a regular basis, and somebody that is not very well known but very popular. And they ask these individuals if there was this hypothetical fire in this apartment complex, who would you help first? And almost every individual in this survey or in this study indicates that the first person they'd help is the family member. The next is the person they're attracted to, and they would move on down the list until they got to a point where everybody had been saved, but not necessarily saved in just a random order. This type of situation is obviously very difficult to replicate in real life, but we do see large numbers of instances of people helping individuals who share our genetic code, much more than we'd expect to see just through chance. And there's even some other more kind of uncomfortable topics that we're going to discuss in the aggression section that show that when people do not share our genetic overlap, not only are we less inclined to help them, but we're more inclined to actually increase our acts of aggression toward them. Another suggestion that maybe being nice, especially to those in our biological spectrum, is something that's just in our code so we can find a way to keep our genes progressing. Another example that's been cited as a kind of a reason for why being prosocial might help us survive was this concept of something that was called reciprocal altruism. This notion that if we do find ourselves in a society of people that are all biologically inclined to help others, that society has an increased chance of surviving. This is actually something that's been linked to different species of animals who have developed all of these different structural things to get them to help each other, even if it might come at the cost of their own life or their own ability to kind of survive in a specific situation. There's numerous studies that have shown that not only do we see large amounts of reciprocal altruism across different species, but those that do not engage in this altruistic behavior within those societies tend to be shunned and not actually receive the benefits of the group as a whole. Now, this might suggest to us that reciprocal altruism is, again, something that's pre-programmed in us, and it just naturally comes about. But there has been some conflicting research on this idea. There was a researcher in 1980 named Hoffman who ran a number of studies to suggest that even if we are necessarily programmed to be altruistic, there might need to be a trigger to get that behavior to emerge. Hoffman suggested that maybe if, say, as a young child, we see our parents or other family members being altruistic, especially towards those within the in-group, that might encourage us to kind of activate that biological predisposition and become more altruistic as we age. And the more and more we're exposed to, the more and more altruistic we get to become. Now, this, again, is a complicated thing to explore. It's very difficult for us to look back at past ancestors and show that ones that weren't being very giving, who didn't have that genetic predisposition to do so, were the ones that were eventually excluded and left to die, and now we're just this byproduct of it. And you haven't also been able to trace a specific gene to being prosocial or more or less prosocial. But it does have an intuitive sense to it. And there's some research that sort of backs it. And it also brings into question this idea of altruism again. If most of our acts of altruism are just for family members or people that we might eventually procreate with, are they really considered acts of altruism on the surface? They still are definitely prosocial behaviors. They're still beneficial to the group as a whole, but that frustrating definition of altruism starts to become more complicated when we think about this. And we can even add to the complication when we think about when we talk about rewards, the benefits that we get. There's many social psychologists that have argued that some of the benefits we get from being prosocial might be more subtle than we originally thought. There was a researcher we're going to reference multiple times in this class named Daniel Batson, whose first contribution to the discussion on prosocial behavior focused on the benefits that people might get from being prosocial that they're not necessarily even aware of at the time. He contended that, yes, sometimes we do nice things in order to be seen as a nice person or to create norms that do perpetuate a society that becomes more giving. But he said that many times we might also be prosocial or even do something that looks altruistic on the surface because of internal struggles that we're going through. We might help, say, a homeless person because we feel guilty about certain things that we've done with respect to finances or how society has given us a chance that these individuals don't seem to have. Or we could help those individuals because we're uncomfortable around them or uncomfortable with the way we feel about ourselves and our peers when we see these individuals. It could also be related to just disgust and this kind of feeling of discomfort around people that are living in situations that would make us feel uncomfortable. So we help them not just because, but because there's a very specific internal motivation to help these individuals. Now, Batson wasn't saying that this means that helping is a shallow, callous thing. Most of Batson's work was focused on how we can find ways to increase this prosocial activity that we see around us. But his suggestion was simply that there probably are a lot of benefits to being helpful that aren't necessarily recognized on the surface. It's not just about getting something immediately after we do something. It could be about a long-term thing or even the ability to help us deal with some of the internal struggles that we're going through when we see somebody in need of help. And this idea eventually led Batson to introduce a very famous concept that he's been tied to throughout his career called the empathy altruism theory. This theory, this idea, suggests that oftentimes when people are encouraged to be prosocial, they will engage in prosocial behavior if there's enough incentive that they can recognize. But if there's not, the only way we can get those individuals to be prosocial, to help another individual, is to activate those emotions that he talked about earlier. In particular, to get people to try to activate emotions that get them to feel and understand how somebody in need of help is actually feeling. One of his classic studies that highlighted this theory was one that we now call the wheelchair Carol Marcy experiment. In this study, Batson invited people to come in and listen to one of their classmates describe something that they were experiencing. Now, half of the participants that were asked to come in and listen to this story about a woman named Carol Marcy were instructed to try to remain as distant and kind of calculated as possible when listening to this story. Just focus on the message and focus on the content of the description. The other half of the individuals in this study were asked to imagine what they would be experiencing if they had encountered something like what Carol was describing. They were asked to imagine the emotions and thoughts that would be going through their heads. And as they listened to this, they were tasked with something kind of random that Batson was using primarily as a distractor, and at the end of the experiment, the true point of the study popped up. As participants were starting to wrap up in the study, a research assistant came into the room with one of two notes for both of the conditions. And half of the conditions with the empathy and the no empathy situation, individuals were handed a note that suggested that Carol Marcy would not be returning to school for the remainder of the semester, but she was in need of some help with catching up with things, and that notes from a classmate would be very beneficial, and the researchers had just learned that the person participating in this study was actually in one of the classes that Carol was taking, and was hoping, after they had heard the story, to be willing to help out Carol in this situation. The other half of the participants, again, half in the empathy condition and half in the no empathy condition, were given similar instructions, but they were told that Carol would actually be returning to class. She just needed help catching up. So if they could exchange some notes with her, hand them to her, then she could find a way to catch up in the class. Essentially, people were given the situation where they'd be seeing her on a regular basis and be reminded of whether or not they said yes to giving her the notes, or they would never see her again, and by saying no, they wouldn't have to really worry about it or be reminded of it in the future. And what Batson was able to show is that in the no empathy condition, that second set of instructions, or that second condition that they introduced, was a big determinant of whether or not people agreed to help with Carol. Those that thought they were going to see her recognized very quickly the guilt and other things that would come along with saying no, and almost all said yes in that condition. But those that learned that she would never be seen again tended to lean towards not helping her in that condition. Another iteration of this study that Batson ran that was talked about in the book also involved the research assistant knowing whether or not this person would help or not, and knowing what was being asked of them. Again, the more and more the kind of weight of saying no was put on somebody, the less and less likely they were to say no. But if they could remain anonymous and they could not be reminded of things, many individuals who were asked to be cold and calculated when listening to Carol Marcy's story ended up saying no. No, they wouldn't take the notes, or no, they wouldn't engage in that extra work to help out this classmate. But again, this was just in the no empathy condition. Batson found that almost every single participant, when encouraged to imagine what Carol Marcy was feeling, tended to agree to share their notes with her, regardless of whether or not they would see her or just be handing off the notes to some third party that would eventually get them to her. And this really highlighted a key component to when we become prosocial. When we do have this enticement to activate emotions, to think about things, we tend to become much more giving to not only our own kin, but large numbers of individuals that are in need of help. And this brings us to another interesting topic. What else emotionally could trigger us to be nice towards other individuals? Is it just empathy that gets us to be more giving, or are there other things that we can do to the internal mind of an individual to get them to be more helpful? One classic study done in 1972 by two researchers named Eisen and Levin strongly suggested that if we make somebody happy or put them in a good mood, there's a really good chance that those individuals will be more prosocial in the near future. One of the classic studies to highlight how this worked is one that I'm still dismayed by how powerful effect they found. In this study, they'd have people just randomly, unknowingly volunteer for this study by going into a phone booth at a mall. Obviously, nowadays we don't have many phone booths around, but in 1970, many individuals who needed to make calls when they were at malls or other public places would use phone booths. They'd put in a little bit of change, dial a number, and based on how long that call was, they'd get back a certain amount of money. Now, in this study that Eisen and Levin ran, what they did to kind of create this weird mood effect is they'd wait for people to go into the booth. When these people would come out, they would drop a pile, they would have a research assistant drop a pile of manila envelopes a specific distance away from these individuals, essentially giving them a chance to help or not help this person that had dropped the manila envelopes. But before these people walked out, they had embedded something that created in some individuals a good mood and in others just kind of no mood at all. In half of the conditions of this study, what they did to just lightly inflate the mood of individuals was they put a dime in the coin exchange slot that was there. If you were around in 1970, you would probably recognize very quickly what doing that would do. When people would make a call back in the 70s on these phones, you would hear coins clink down after the call had been finished, and everybody, almost everybody at least, would inherently do the same thing. They'd reach into the change slot to see if anything had fallen out of the change slot. And for people in this one condition where the dime was placed there, they'd get that little emotional boost of finding a dime. Obviously, this would not help these individuals necessarily pay for their rent or their mortgage or anything like that, but it was enough in the 1970s to give a slight mood boost and maybe help somebody buy a piece of candy. In the other half of the participants, they ensured, Eisen and Levin, that there was no extra change found in that coin slot. It wasn't that these people would be depressed by not finding it, it's just they wouldn't get that small boost in their emotions. And again, what they wanted to see was whether or not that boost in emotions would increase or decrease people's willingness to help this person, this research assistant that had dropped the manila envelopes. And what Eisen and Levin found was that 84% of the people that had just randomly discovered a dime in the coin slot helped out the person that had dropped the manila envelope. And only 4%, a measly 4%, when they did not find the dime, were willing to help out this research assistant. And there have been some people that have been a little skeptical of these numbers because they are so astounding. And others that have tried to replicate things that promote good mood have not found quite as robust of an effect. But there has been a consistent trend in social research to suggest that if people are put in a good mood, they do have a tendency to be more prosocial. And there's been lots of explanations for maybe why this is the case. Some have suggested that maybe it's just because when we're helpful, we're looking for lots of ways to increase our mood even more. Or maybe when we're happy and something good happens, we want to make others happy. Whatever it is, though, there does seem to be a consensus that not only making somebody empathetic can make us happy, or helpful, but making us happy can also make us helpful. This might lead you to ask, well, what about bad moods? There was a theory back in the 1970s that suggested that if we instill a bad mood in somebody, they're more likely to be helpful. It's called the negative status relief hypothesis. It suggested that if you were sad or angry, you might help somebody so you can turn that frown upside down or make the anger go away. And in the 1970s, there was some initial research to suggest that there was maybe some merit to this negative status relief hypothesis. A trio of researchers named Harris, Benson, and Hall ran a study at a local church in 1975 where they asked people to give a donation either before they went into a confession room or after they went into a confession room. For those of you that aren't very familiar with confession rooms or Christianity, there are many churches in different areas where people will actually come in at random times during the week and sit in a room with a priest or pastor or whatever that individual is called based on the religion and talk about some of the things that they've done that they're remorseful for or feel guilty about. And after they're done talking about these things, the priest or pastor or whatever they're defined in that religion will do is usually give person something to do to kind of make up for those things that they've done in kind of an amoral way. Usually it involves things like saying hymns or doing certain things for others, but when these people promise to do these things, they're theoretically, according to religious beliefs, usually absolved of these problems or absolved of these, if we're going to use the terminology, sins that these people have committed. This is what Harris, Benson, and Hall were trying to take advantage of in this study. They knew that people were coming in filled with guilt, and people were leaving with significantly less guilt in them. So again, they would sometimes ask people to make a donation before going into church or after they'd been in church. And what they showed in their study, or at least they argued in their publications, was that people contributed significantly more if they were giving to this charity before they went in to confess versus after. And it suggested that maybe these people were doing it to relieve the guilt that they were feeling as they were heading into this confession. Now, it's important to note here that it's been very difficult for people to replicate this study that they ran in 1975. And most research has actually suggested the opposite of what Harris, Benson, and Hall found. Most studies tend to show that if you're angry or you're sad, you're actually less inclined to help other individuals. The opposite of what this negative status relief hypothesis was surmised. And in fact, recently, what lots of people have looked at is why this particular effect doesn't work. And two researchers named DeWall and Baumeister have suggested in their studies that one of the biggest reasons why we don't help when we're in these bad moods is because that bad mood tends to kind of diminish something that triggers prosocial behavior in the first place. If you're angry, if you're upset, if you're scared even, one of the things that you really become incapable of doing is being empathetic towards other individuals. And since empathy is a very powerful catalyst for prosocial behavior, even if this negative status relief hypothesis has some merit to it, the diminished empathy tends to make us less prosocial when we're in these moods than when we're not. So if we want kind of a clear picture on this, we can surmise that there's lots of emotional things that can get us to be more and less helpful, but some that don't work very well. If we make somebody happy, make them try to imagine that they're in the shoes of another person, the odds of them helping is definitely enhanced. If we make somebody angry or sad or instill some other negative mood in somebody, well, then we can't usually rely on them being prosocial at that moment. And this relates to another negative emotion that researchers were looking at in the 1970s, the amount of anxiety or stress that somebody reports feeling. One of the first studies to suggest that being stressed can decrease our tendency to be prosocial was one that was explored by Batson himself again and another researcher named Darley. In this study, they invited participants to come in and participate in what they called a two-step study. They were first supposed to go to one room on this gigantic campus that they were using in this project and fill out a survey about themselves. When participants arrived in this first part of the study, they were already put in one of two conditions. Some, when they walked in, were told by a very friendly researcher that they had arrived a little bit sooner than they had thought, and that the study that they were going to participate in required them to do two different things, but there was a lot of time to get these things done. The other participants, regardless of when they arrived, were told by a relatively rushed and stressed researcher that they had arrived later than anticipated, and that for them to complete everything that they needed to complete in the study, they had to quickly fill out one part of the survey and then get to another location on campus where they would have to complete the second part of the survey. In essence, what Darley and Batson were trying to do was get some individuals right off the bat to feel stressed, feel rushed, and feel like they had to move quickly. Where another half of the participants were put in a situation, right, and they walked in, of feeling comfortable and feeling like there was no need to fly through what it was they were doing. After both groups of participants, in neither condition, finished the first part of the study, they were then all asked to go all the way across campus to finish the second part. Again, one half was told they had to rush across campus, while the other group was told to just make sure you're there in a reasonable amount of time. In this study, they ensured that the people going from one part of campus to the other would follow a very predictable path. And along the way, Batson and Darley had inserted a Confederate in the study to trip and fall in front of these participants as they were walking. And what they wanted to see wasn't what these people were doing in the surveys, but instead what they wanted to see was whether or not these people would stop and help this person that had fallen. And what they found was, as you probably can predict, that most people who were in a rush just ran around this person that had fallen and hurt themselves. Where if people were given an ample amount of time to get from point A to B, they oftentimes stopped and asked the person if they could help or even tried to assist in the situation. And it really highlighted again how triggering specific emotions or mindsets in individuals could make us more or less inclined to help. If we're feeling relaxed, calm, we help. If we're feeling stressed, rushed, we tend to be much less prosocial at that moment. And this leads us to some really interesting implications about the things that can trigger us to help. But another area that we started to go to in the 1970s wasn't whether or not we kind of evoke helping behaviors in individuals, but what led to so many individuals who had an opportunity to help not to help another individual. One of the classic concepts that was introduced in the 1960s by social psychologists was something called the bystander effect. It was this really interesting phenomenon that had popped up numerous times over multiple decades and centuries, where somebody in need of help was not helped by a large group of individuals who could potentially help. And not only that, but the bystander effect suggested that the larger the group, the more people that could help, the less likely somebody was to receive aid. And this particular effect really came to a head and started to be studied by social psychologists in the 1970s as a result of a very tragic case that occurred in the mid-1960s, a case that we nowadays call the Kitty Genovese case. And the case linked to the woman, unfortunately, who lost her life as a result of this bystander effect. I don't want to butcher the story of this particular woman and all of the things that happened to her by jumping from topic to topic. So instead, what I thought we'd do to better understand the Kitty Genovese case and how it relates to the bystander effect is watch a video on this, one that highlights the details of her tragic demise and also the work that was done by two researchers, Bob Latinay and John Darley, to better understand what was behind this incident and the bystander effect as a whole. So what you'll see on the class site is a link to this Kitty Genovese case, and it'll first describe what it is or what happened, and then afterward it'll break down some of the components that led up to this bystander effect. I believe the person that's actually in this video is not Bib Latinay, but instead John Darley. And Darley will talk about these different steps that occur along the way. He'll say that in the Kitty Genovese case, one of the things that could have happened was people didn't see the event occurring, or they maybe didn't interpret it as an emergency, something that he ties later to a concept called pluralistic ignorance. This fact that many of us might see a situation as worrisome, come to the conclusion that it's a problem, but then decide because we're in a group with others that maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's actually not an emergency or not a problem as a result of the kind of triggers we have when looking at others and trying to go off of the actions of other individuals. Pluralistic ignorance is something that's also talked about in the book, and it's cited as being a big problem for lots of situations where we don't help out in an emergency when we indeed should. But Latinay and Darley also argued, and you're going to see this in the video, that there's more to it than just pluralistic ignorance. Another topic that they talk about is something called diffusion of responsibility. And you're going to see a really ingenious study that had people put in a situation where it was either a clear-cut emergency where they had to help because nobody else could, or one where even though they didn't know who would help, there was potential for other individuals that could assist. All of these things, again, come together to produce the bystander effect. And instead of having me give just a horrible rendition of the story itself, I want you to watch the video link on this. And after you're done, you can come back and we can have some closing comments on this module. All right. My hope is that you had an opportunity to watch that Kitty Genovese video, and you got to learn more about the tragic incident that occurred, but also a lot of the research that it spurned on and some of the really interesting insights that we gained once we started looking at this bystander effect from a scientific perspective. My hope is also, once you've done that you really do have a pretty good understanding of a couple concepts relating to prosocial behavior. the things that can trigger it, and also some of the situational factors that can increase or decrease our tendencies to be prosocial. This line of thinking, this line of research is what we're going to continue into in our next class. But we're going to explore a lot of avenues that we didn't have a chance to discuss in this one. In particular, we'll talk about certain groups that are more prosocial and less, and societal things that we can do to kind of take advantage of some of the knowledge that we have when it comes to prosocial behavior. But for now, I'm going to bid you adieu, wish you the best, and say I hope to see you soon. Take care, everybody.